I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at expanders. Now then, expanders are kind of like the opposite of compressors. So in order to understand what an expander can do, we need to understand what a compressor can do. Now, if there's one thing I've learned over many years of teaching, is that you can't learn about compression enough. It's such a ubiquitous, brilliant processor for the way that audio can be treated, and it's so useful on so many different sounds that a little bit of a compression recap is always worth it. So what do compressors do? Well, what they do is they set a threshold point above which we can restrict how much louder a sound can get. So above that threshold point, effectively what we can do is to use a ratio control to determine how much we want to squeeze the volume of signals that go above the threshold point. So in other words, compressors make things quieter. They can make things a lot quieter, or just a little bit. So effectively what we can do is to use them to squash the dynamics of our tracks. So if that's compression, expansion is the opposite. What it allows us to do is to set a threshold point, and above that threshold point, we can make any signals expand in terms of their dynamic range. In other words, get louder than they would ordinarily. Now, expanders are incredibly useful, not just for increasing dynamic range, but actually almost for acting as kind of like transient designers. The opportunity to take the transients, the individual sort of percussive hits within, let's say, a beat loop, and sort of make more of them, maybe getting the sort of signal parts of quieter moments even quieter, whilst at the same time boosting the volume of the bits we want to make even louder. Now, expanders, it turns out, are incredibly useful if what you want to do is to bring more clarity to a mix that is over-cluttered by loads of information. And I've made videos in the past about the idea of having 5 different beat loops and trying to find a role for each one of those to play. And expanders can be added into that conversation in terms of being a useful way to bring more clarity and purpose to a sound so that it's not just taking up loads of mix room. So I've got 3 separate parts playing within this track, and already it's too busy. I've got a main beat loop, I've got what's referred to by Logic as a sort of topper loop, so in other words, high frequency content, which is adding another loop, and then we've got a relatively busy bass line happening as well. Let's just have a listen. Okay, so loads of stuff is happening already. I wouldn't want to immediately have to start by thinking, right, well, what else am I going to add to this track? Loads of stuff already needs sorting out. So what we'll do for a moment is we'll just solo this first beat. And what I'm going to do is to come down to the dynamics folder, which is here, and I'm going to come and find the expander, which is just here, halfway down the list. Now, the expander looks, if you work with compression, a little bit like the compressor. What we've got is a whole series of controls which look a bit like compression controls. Firstly, we've got our threshold point, and what that's going to do is to process the signals that come through the threshold and are therefore louder than it. But unlike compression, instead of making those signals quieter, what it's going to do instead is to expand them. So it sort of stands to reason that if I was to listen to this loop in isolation, I'm expecting that what I'm going to hear is a bunch of individual hits that are quite loud, and then some others in between them that are maybe a little bit quieter. Yeah, sure enough. So we've got this dominant kick, and then what we've got is a whole series of other individual transient moments that vary in volume in between those individual hits. So let's just begin to see what we can do when we start expanding a beat loop. What I'm going to do is to set the threshold at a point where I'm guaranteed that every single moment is going to come along and exceed the threshold point. Then what I've got is a ratio control. Now, effectively, ratio in an expander works upside down to the way that it works in a compressor. So in other words, a ratio of 1:1, the maximum amount, is going to provide no expansion at all, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, 0.5:1 is going to produce as much expansion as the expander is capable of. So effectively what I can do is start over here and dial this backwards, and the more we go backwards from this point, the more expansion we're going to hear. We've got a gain control, which is going to allow us to set the overall output volume, and then a bit like a compressor, what we've also got is an attack and release dial, which is going to control how quickly the expander does its expansion once the signal gets through the threshold point. Okay, that's enough talking from me. I'm going to press play. We're just going to play around with some settings and begin to see what expansion can do. So lots of what's happening here will be familiar to you if you've worked extensively with compressors. So at the moment, I'm just playing around with the attack time and the release time. If the release time is too long, the expander doesn't have a chance to fully sort of stop expanding before the next hit comes along. So as a result, we don't get this kind of punchy effect, we get a much smoother one. And if that's what we're after, then fine, let's expand or increase, sorry, I should say, the release time. Similarly, if I want to let some of a transient through before I begin to expand it, I can increase the attack time. It's literally just controlling how quickly the expander responds once a signal has got through the threshold point. But in particular, what we notice if we go for these really extreme settings is what happens when I turn this on and off. And you can almost hear why I mentioned transient design. Rather now than a signal which is constantly sort of feeding us lots of information every time an individual hit plays, what we've now got is this sense slightly that we've got some hits being prioritized at the expense of others. Some are getting quieter and some are being pushed up in volume. So this is no expansion on this loop. Okay, so let's have a look at the second signal. You can obviously hear that I've punched that in for the second half. Again, I'm going to solo this sort of top loop, and we'll see what happens when we are working with a different type of loop, which has got its own sort of intrinsic rhythm. Again, now, because I've just used it, the expander is going to be in my most recently selected plugins. So I'm going to just come in here very quickly, and what we'll do is to also configure a solution for this loop as well. And we're really hearing on that topper loop what happens when we provide this expansion instead of this really sort of driven, really sort of long sounding reverb that we're getting on that sort of more extended hit. Effectively, what expansion is doing is giving us more of that at the beginning, and then that sound is sort of disappearing and getting out of the way from a kind of mix clutter point of view, much more than it was before. Now, I've deliberately, in order to really make the point, selected incredibly sort of extreme ratio settings. Remember, the ratio works upside down to the way that it does within a compressor. And if I like this idea, but I just want less of it, then of course I can increase the ratio. And actually, whilst it would be a subtle effect, that would be quite an interesting parameter to automate within the mix as well. So what I'm going to do is just put the bass line back in. I'll come back to a kind of static setting for this, and we'll just hear the difference now in the across the entire mix with no expansion, and then the expanders sort of punched in for the second half. And again, we're looking here, what we're concentrating on is how much mix space there is for these three sounds together with and without the expanders. So that's an amazingly powerful difference. The amount of mix space that is created by using expanders in this way is enormous. So we've looked at kind of creating mix space in other ways with loops, and expanders can definitely be sort of added to the conversation as far as that is concerned, because what we're getting now is certain hits being prioritized in terms of their volume and the rest of a loop being kind of squashed down in terms of its volume, making sure that we're getting the most important parts of a loop and much less of the kind of clutter within the mix instead. And so So yeah, definitely experiment with this particular technique if you're finding that lots of the elements of your productions are kind of fighting each other for space.